The unspoken elephant in the room here is the development of artificial intelligence and the need for radically more electricity to feed these
Hmm.
machines and these training, the data centers and the chips and NVIDIA and that whole boom. As a heavy user of AI, I can tell you that is a very real breakthrough, a seismic change in humanity, and the power needs to keep the world on that Kurzweilian compute logarithmic line will be met. And I think natural gas is the obvious fuel for that, clean burning. Maybe you toss in a few carbon capture facilities on the back end to greenwash yourself. But we are going to win the AI race in the US on the back of natural gas.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. As today's guest rightfully often repeats, energy is life. Without it, there's no economy, no means to power the systems that society depends on. And like it or not, the world still runs on hydrocarbons, most especially oil. Well, oil's in an interesting place right now. It's starting to become cheap again. After trading near $120 a barrel following the Russian embargo ensuing from the war in Ukraine, it's now nearly half that, trading at $67 a barrel the day of this recording. And new technologies are creating oil substitutes from natural gas liquids. And the OPEC cartel, which has exerted control over world oil supply and therefore price, suddenly looks in danger of losing its grip. What do all these mean for the future of oil and, in turn, for the economy? And where are the best opportunities for investors in all this? To find out, we've got the good fortune today to sit down with the green chicken himself, energy analyst Doomberg. Doomberg, thanks so much for joining us today.
Adam, great to be back with you. It's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to a fantastic discussion again today.
Great. Well, same here, my friend. All right, look, lots of specific questions to get into again about oil. Very quickly, though, let's just start at the very high level. What's your current assessment of the oil market today?
In preparation for today's discussion, I went back and listened to both my immediate prior appearance and then the debate, very friendly debate that we had on peak cheap oil with Adam Rosenzweig from GNR. And I think much the same. Back then we made the point that the most important question and a macroeconomic analyst can ask themselves is the world long or short energy? Back then, we said the world was heading into a glut of natural gas, which was causing imbalances across the entire sort of primary energy market complex. That has proven to be true. I believe that engine switching is to natural gas away from oil, as predicted back then, is indeed a real headwind, which we can talk about. But by and large, the world is amply supplied with physical, both in oil and especially natural gas, but also coal. The world has reacted to the energy crisis. Most shortages are followed by gluts, and this time period appears to be no different. And so, absent major geopolitical risk, which is always a hedge for inelastic commodities like oil, we are still relatively bearish. The medium-term outlook for oil, again, all things being equal. Of course, if a major war breaks out in the Middle East or the oil fields in Saudi Arabia are carpet bombed, all bets are off, and you can see oil spike on the red headline. But again, on balance, there's plenty of hydrocarbons in the world. We are as far away from peak cheap oil as we've been in many decades, and there are trends in the hydrocarbons market that are quite predictable, that are proving out to be true.
Okay, maybe let's tick through each one of these if we can. I want to get to the engine switching in just a minute, but I guess first off, at a very high level, you're saying the world is amply supplied, so that's sort of a supply side of the equation. How about the demand side? Is potentially some of the lower price we're seeing right now for oil potentially due to a slowing demand, a slowing global economy?
Well, those are two separate things. A slowing demand for oil and a slowing global economy need not necessarily be correlated because of the aforementioned engine switching. So what we're seeing right now is in many parts of the world, natural gas is so cheap that it's basically free. And people are responding to that. So on an energy content basis, natural gas in the US, for example, is somewhere between $10 and $15 a barrel of oil equivalent. And they do the same thing. Like oil and natural gas are burned to create heat. Heat is used to do work. People don't really care where the work comes from. And in many ways, natural gas is a superior fuel to oil if you have the infrastructure to handle it safely. And those massive price differentials, both here and other parts of the world, are leading arbitrageurs to make those investments in order to close that gap, which is a very lucrative business, by the way, because you have basically a guaranteed return until that arbitrage closes. And we're a long way from that arbitrage closing, at least in certain parts of the world. And so because oil and natural gas and coal are highly inelastic and broadly fungible, it doesn't take much in the way of switching to give the appearance of slowing demand, which I believe many are confusing that signal to be a potential, warning light for a global recession. But in reality, I just think it's the natural forces of arbitrage playing themselves out, as we predicted on our last couple of appearances. And I should tell the audience that China moves at China's speed, and China is the world's largest oil importer. And if China has access to dirt cheap natural gas via landed pipeline and relatively more expensive natural gas via LNG, it's going to burn that natural gas in lieu of diesel. It's also producing an enormous number of electric vehicles. BYD is about to pass Ford in its unit volume, and all they make is battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, mostly for the domestic market right now, though they do export a fair bit. And so you have EVs eating away at the demand for gasoline, and you have LNG trucks eating away at the demand for diesel. And that's, last I checked, 2/3 of the 3-2-1 crack spread. And so we're seeing a slowdown in the demand for oil at the world's largest energy importer. And it doesn't take much in the way of such a slowdown for that to materially impact prices because of the inelasticity of demand of those primary energy for, yeah, exactly.
Got it. All right. So you basically get the biggest player in terms of importer, again, needing less oil because it's doing this engine switching that you're talking about, and given the inelasticity of the market, even small amounts in small decreases in demand can have big impacts on the oil price. So totally get that. And I'm not saying this is happening, but I'm just saying both things could be true, right? Where we could be seeing a reduction in demand for oil for the reasons you listed, and the economy could be slowing as well. In other words, those two things can happen at the same time. Not saying they are right now, but if they both happen, that would even further decrease demand for oil, correct?
And I think the fact that both probably aren't happening to the extent that the people calling for a recession are predicting is evidence that the economy is doing okay. And it's more this engine switching that is driving. Because I think if we were heading for a recession, we wouldn't be in the high 60s like we are now. We'd be much lower than that. And don't forget, I mean, the price of oil is still actively managed by OPEC to the extent that they're holding off incremental supply from the markets. And it won't take too much in the way of a slowing, global economy for a few of those members at the margin to panic and try to get theirs while they're getting as good. All cartels ultimately are susceptible to cheating and game theory. And so I think the fact that oil is still holding in there actually relatively strong, and at 67 Brent, 67 WTI, 70 Brent as we're recording this, in the face of natural gas still being priced quite negatively in the Permian Basin, is testimony to the fact that the economy is actually doing relatively okay, despite this engine switching. But all bets are off. Yeah, if we see a recession in China, like a real one, then oil is way overpriced. By the way, I'm not calling for that, and I think oil has been relatively and steadily sold, and perhaps even oversold here in the past few weeks. And so one is always careful to not call market inflection points, but we are a little oversold. Crack spreads are on the floor. You're starting to see capitulation on Twitter. I think we might be at least near at least a short-term consolidation point, let's say, in the energy markets. But if you pushed me, I would say there's still more headwinds than tailwinds for sure.
Okay. And really what I was trying to just get to is sort of what would the impact of slowing economic growth have on the oil price? And it sounds like you're saying, hey, right now it seems like the economy is actually still hanging in there pretty well for all the reasons you mentioned. But did I hear correctly that if the world were to tip into recession, you would expect to see oil substantially lower than it is here in the mid 60s?
Yeah, and if you told me that in the fourth quarter there would be an economic panic because of a bunch of fraud uncovered in China and all the numbers were made up, and the world started to believe that maybe the Chinese economy was going to go into a recession, yeah, I'd want to own puts in oil, not calls. That's for sure.
Okay. All right. So let me ask about something else that we talked about last time you were on. Because you've talked about how, uh, fossil fuels can be fungible, and I know it's not a simple matter, but at the end of the day, they're all hydrocarbons, and that's what we power fossil energy on. The last times we talked, you went pretty deep into uh, the new innovation and technology development that's going on around natural gas condensates or natural gas liquids. Not liquid natural gas, but condensates that can be taken out of natural gas. And they are, forgive me for forgetting the chemistry. I don't know it nearly as well as you do, obviously. But it's basically other sort of hydrocarbon chains that can be used, in a lot of the same commercial processes that we burn sort of conventional petroleum for here. I think there's even been some developments on this since we last talked. I think there was a big plant that came online somewhere in the world. You'll know better than I. But where are we in that story right now? Are we really beginning to see additional supply come on the quote unquote oil market from these natural gas condensates?
So natural gas liquids more so than condensates. It's the nomenclature can be confusing at times. So NGLs, if you sort of think of oil on the spectrum of oil to NGLs to natural gas, you're getting lighter and lighter in the hydrocarbon spectrum, and that necessarily means that you are um, addressing certain types of engines, for example, or certain chemical processes that are reliant on such input. So, for example, you could take light hydrocarbons, and if you invested in the right reactor chemistry at a refinery, you could, make them higher molecular weight and then blend them in with gasoline or jet fuel or even diesel, depending on how high you go. But there's scores of billions of dollars being invested all across Texas and Louisiana to bring these light hydrocarbons all the way down to including natural gas to the market more efficiently. These people are doing these investments because they recognize the value of these hydrocarbons they're currently selling at a discount to oil. But again, it doesn't take much in the way of displacement for prices to be significantly impacted. So the best analogy I can give people is, and I've said it here before, when oil was peaking above $120 a barrel, as you said in your introduction, Biden released 1 million barrels a day of oil from the SPR, and that cut the price of oil in half. That was 1% of global supply. So let's take the chemical industry. The chemical industry is about 7% of the demand for the molecules that come out of the oil and gas sector. Well, if more and more of the chemical industry demand is going to be shifted away from heavy products that go into the cracker to light ones like natural gas liquids, you're going to see a displacement in demand akin to what we're seeing in China vis-a-vis trucks. And in China, for example, which is a point I should have made earlier, the switch to LNG trucks isn't just a cost arbitrage play. Natural gas burns so much cleaner than diesel, and the Chinese Communist Party cares very deeply about air pollution. PM 2.5 measurements, as published by the US Embassy, are a political sore point for them. Chinese citizens use their VPN to see what the US government is telling them about the daily pollution levels in Beijing and Shanghai. And they would like those pollution levels to come down. And the two main drivers are coal and diesel. And once you switch to a liquefied natural gas burning truck, that demand is gone. Like you're not going to switch back. It's very clean. It comes with other benefits, and it happens to be cheaper. So who doesn't want a deal? Everybody wants a deal on energy. And so over time, as we've argued back when it was controversial, and now seemingly people are coming around to it, the very definition of oil is blurring. And in the long run, all hydrocarbons will trade for roughly the same price, corrected for logistics. The two ways in which the arbitrage will close are either we will molecularly alter the hydrocarbons to make them fit the engines we have. In other words, turn natural gas into gasoline or jet fuel. or we will switch the engines because there are cheaper, cleaner burning hydrocarbons available. And it's worthwhile to make that T equals zero capital investment to capture the arbitrage in the fuel prices. And this is forever thus, by the way. It used to be that there was much larger differentials between the various grades of crude, and those have all closed over time as refineries have invested in the hydro treating technologies needed to remove sulfur from heavy grades, and so on. And so over time, we define oil as any hydrocarbon that finds its way into a refinery. And you could even be more broad and say any hydrocarbon that also displaces what traditional oil products do in the economy. And arbitrage is a very powerful force. And it amazes me how people who have a vested interest in the price direction movement of particular hydrocarbons refuse to see that this is a force that should probably not be bet against. These things are fungible. People don't really care where they get their work from. They want the work done as cheaply as possible. And one thing that must be said about the fossil fuel industry is they are incredible drivers of deflation. The price of oil today, as measured in ounces of gold, has basically never been cheaper, except for COVID, which is, of course, the grand exception that doesn't really teach us very much, except about
because oil went to zero for a brief moment.
Yeah, negative $37 a barrel on the famous closing of that one contract. And yeah, so if you just erase those 3 months, oil has literally never been cheaper, as measured in the most durable money possible, which is ounces of gold.
All right, so I find this super fascinating, and again, we went pretty deep into it last time. But I am curious, since we last talked, I mean, natural gas has been very cheap, right? I think most people are familiar with how, for many years, and it's probably still in practice in many places, the oil fields will flare off the natural gas because they had no other way to do anything with it. But we're increasingly finding, all these ways to create additional hydrocarbons from the natural gas and natural gas liquids. Thanks for the correction there. There's now a real economic incentive because of this arbitrage to take the cheap natural gas and turn it into something that can be of use in the economy, and maybe at a lower price than conventional oil, and therefore the economy has a pull for that type of solution. So, are we indeed seeing this happening? You talked about the engine switching that's going on in China, but are we seeing this happen, with an accelerating pace here in the States or in the West?
Well, China moves at China speed. So let's be clear. Even we are shocked by the rate at which China moves.
And just to be clear, China moves very fast relative.
Yeah, China speed is what we say in the industry, right? You wake up one day and suddenly they've scooped you and you're out of business. In April, according to Bloomberg, 1 out of every 3 new long-haul trucks sold in China was powered by natural gas, which blew our minds. And even we didn't see that coming as fast. And that switching has displaced hundreds of thousands of barrels of demand for diesel. And since a diesel is what, at most a third of a barrel of oil, you multiply that by 3 for sort of the impact on the total demand for oil. In the U.S., it's a bit slower, but it's happening. And beyond that, 2 things are converging that make it even more of a headwind for oil. One, as you mentioned, flaring is what we used to do when we didn't have sufficient pipeline capacity. And the reason why you would flare is because of the second reason, which is oil is in the shale patch, often co-produced with natural gas and NGLs. And you have to have a place for it in order to enable production. Well, at COP28, the world decided that flaring was a big no-no, and we were all going to count our methane emissions, and we were going to stop leaks and all of this stuff. And so suddenly, the urgency to do something with natural gas became even more front and center because you couldn't just burn it anymore. By the way, that's why natural gas is selling for negative spot prices in the Permian Basin today at the Waha Hub, $2 a million BTU negative as we speak, because they can't just flare it, so they have to put it somewhere, and they're literally paying people to take it away. Well, that arbitrage is very powerful. And there's a strong desire because of OPEC, who is artificially keeping the price of oil higher than it otherwise would be, to keep producing that oil. That combination of no longer being able to burn it and or flare it, I guess we should say more correctly. And the desire to keep producing means that we're seeing massive investments to collect and move natural gas and NGLs to various markets that can do something more productive with them. So the Matterhorn pipeline, which is going to enable a 2.5 BCF per day of offtake capacity in the Permian, guess what? That's going to result in more oil production. Because the moment that pipeline is ready to take its full allocation, everybody is going to be drilling holes that are producing both natural gas and oil and shoving the natural gas into that pipeline. And it's predicted that that pipeline will only relieve the constraint of natural gas from Permian oil production till about 2026. Really? And so we're going to need another big pipeline coming soon after that, and another one after that. The again, like the folks who are counting well decay rates and tier 1 wells versus tier 2 wells are looking for an answer that just isn't there in our view. The thing that is constraining oil production in the U.S. shale patch is natural gas offtake capacity. And once those pipelines are built, they will be filled. And we can produce so much oil and natural gas in North America right now. It's crazy. We wrote about Western Canada and the Montney Shale up there. And it's just, British Columbia has gone from 2 to 6.5 BCF per day of natural gas production in the face of rock bottom prices, because it's so cheap and abundant. And they're opening up an LNG export terminal. They just completed a major pipeline to feed it. Mexico is building LNG export terminals. Both of them are taking advantage of California's unwillingness to do so, and they're going to circumvent the Panama Canal and be able to ship LNG directly to the Pacific, and China and Korea and Japan and all the major natural gas importers are going to be fed by Canada and Mexico. The Mexican natural gas is actually going to come from the Permian because they're connected to the Permian via land pipelines. And so all of this stuff is just one giant equilibrium game. And gluts flows downward. Like when you have a glut of the lowest cost hydrocarbon, the cost of all of the hydrocarbons converge lower. That's just what's happening.
Super fascinating. You said one thing I just want to make sure I understand. There are people out there that are looking at rig counts and outputs in the shale patches and, are making the case that these basins are beginning to enter decline, right? This is sort of the peak cheap oil theory. Did I hear you correctly where you said actually the oil production there is limited right now by the ability to deal with the natural gas that comes off of these plays, meaning if we solve that, perhaps through these new pipelines, that will then enable drillers to go out and drill more. So will increase the oil output going forward, but B, since we're taking things like these natural gas liquids from the gas that's coming off of here and turning that into oil, right, hydrocarbons that get into a refinery, we will actually be increasing production by figuring out how to better take off the natural gas from these fields.
All of the above. Look, if we had infinite natural gas offtake capacity from the Permian Basin, we would be producing far more oil than we are today, in no small part because the OPEC cartel has worked diligently to keep oil higher than it otherwise would be. And there are consequences to that, which is what we wrote about in a piece called How OPEC Ends. Like the longer they do this, which I understand, game theory says that's perversely the right thing to do. But the grinding forces of deflation and technology will eventually erode at the foundations of OPEC's strength to the point where one more brick from the bottom and the whole Jenga pile collapses. And I think we're very close to that. If we had infinite offtake capacity in the Marcellus Shale, for example, and we'd just seen the Mountain Valley Pipeline come into service, and we'll see, even though Henry Hub is, $2.25 million BTU today, the strip price is such that it is above. The strip price, by the way, is the average of the 1-year forward futures curve price, which is how most of industry actually buys and sells natural gas between themselves, is above the cost of production. Think about it. The cost of production in the Permian and various other U.S. shales is like $2.50 per million BTU. That's $12 a barrel oil. We have effectively a limitless supply of hydrocarbons that can be produced at Saudi Arabian oil prices. Like the economy is going to reorient around taking advantage of those molecules, especially when you consider that they're cleaner burning. There's no sulfur in natural gas. You can use it in your home with no major ventilation equipment other than the occasional stove fan. You burn it indoors. You would never light your barbecue up indoors, at least not with coal. Um, you can burn natural gas indoors and not worry about it. It's so clean. It's a gas. It's dangerous. Sometimes it explodes. There's nothing. There's always trade-offs with these molecules. But yeah, if we had infinite natural gas and NGL offtake capacity, because in some of the shales, NGL offtake is becoming a bit of a constraint, you would find that we would be able to produce far more oil than we do today. And when we have no offtake constraints and then oil begins to turn over, I'll be the first to say we've probably reached peak in those shale fields. That doesn't mean the world is anywhere near peak cheap oil. It just means these particular fields are about to roll over. But the Permian, boy, I mean, I talk to industry insiders all the time. Many of them cheer us on in our writing and validate our writing, but can't say so publicly. I was speaking to one the other day who's really early in the U.S. shale natural gas industry, and his direct quote to me was something along the lines of, I don't know much about natural gas except that we have way too much of it.
Okay, high quality problem to have, I suppose. Okay, so I want to get to how are we, is it looking like we are aware of that as a nation, and beginning to direct our energy policy to saying, hey, let's take advantage of this great advantage we have here. But before I get there, let's talk about the OPEC situation for a moment. So as you mentioned, you just wrote this piece on it. They've kept the oil price high, as game theory says they should, but they get more and more vulnerable to the dynamics that are going on here with the very cheap natural gas supply that we have here. So if OPEC were to say break, what would that world look like?
It would look like a lot lower oil price, that's for sure. And it would be probably pretty disruptive to the countries in OPEC who rely on relatively high prices of oil for their domestic budgets and so on. And so then you would see a crisis and you would see oil production stop in some of those countries, and oil would then spike on shortage of demand. The global demand for hydrocarbons is a upward sloping, gently sinusoidal wave up and to the right. And so it goes through cycles. But today, yeah, OPEC. By the way, I mean, when we wrote that piece, we were motivated to do so for a variety of reasons, but one of them was the fact that under the radar almost, OPEC is shrinking. Um, you know, 5 years ago, OPEC had 15 member countries, and we should say there's a difference between OPEC Plus and OPEC, and we'll get to that in a second. But the core OPEC, the ones who are like signed on the dotted line to meet their production quotas, they're down to 12 countries today from 15 in 2019. Qatar left in 2019 to focus on its quote unquote natural gas business, hint, hint. And Ecuador left in 2020. And then at the beginning of this year, Angola left. And by the way, Angola's no small player. It produces somewhere around 1.2 million barrels a day. And so if you take the 12 remaining OPEC members, Canada and the US produce 75% as much oil as the entire OPEC cartel today. And they produce twice as much natural gas as the OPEC cartel today. And then you mix in the fact that the US is making a push into Latin America with our Guyana play, Exxon's Guyana play, and our rattling around in Venezuela in this context. Venezuela is a founding member of OPEC. We view the protests in Brazil with some interest, and not necessarily about the whole free speech and election stuff, but more about the battle to keep Brazil either in the US sphere of influence or under BRICS. And Brazil is now a major producer of oil. And then finally, and we're writing a piece on this, which we'll publish early next week, on Milei in Argentina and the Vaca Muerta shale, which is one of the largest shales in the world, and is somewhere between Eagle Ford and the Permian, depending on whether you're looking at potential to produce oil or natural gas. It's a massive field. And they just passed this law, Milei's sort of big campaign promise, where they've basically told the international oil and gas industry, we're open for business. Come and invest here. Government will not get in the way. So you could imagine a world where the US suddenly plants a flag in Guyana, Venezuela, combines those two countries with all the majors, accumulating around Guyana today, takes Brazil out of the grips of BRICS and brings it back into the sort of Monroe Doctrine, and Malaysia, Argentina develops the next Permian, the Western Hemisphere is going to be more than self-sufficient and, in fact, pretty determinative for energy prices. I think that's the grand game that's being played. We're going to write a piece about the battle for Brazil after this Argentina one publishes, but that's where we're headed. When we view the social upheavals in countries like Venezuela and Brazil, any reading of history will tell you that it almost always comes down to oil and to energy and to natural gas. The geopolitics of oil are far more determinative than contemporary journalists ascribe it. But historically, decades after these events unfold, the aha moment of, oh yeah, this was about oil, almost always comes through.
Yeah, they say all wars are about resources at the end of the day. And no resources is essential, at least so far, to how the world works as oil. Okay. So here's where my brain is going, Doomberg. From what you laid out there, I can totally see the US and the West saying, yeah, that's a good strategy for our interests, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful to basically reduce the dependency that we and the rest of the world have on the current oil producing countries, and especially if the world shifts more towards natural gas. I mean, the cheaper price of oil helps our economy. If the world shifts more to natural gas, we're completely swimming in it, right? So why don't we just accelerate this, right? From your perch, do you see national policy heading that direction? And then I'll wrap this up with my second question, which is, there are definitely energy policy differences between the two presidential candidates right now. I don't know if presidential policies really matter that much, in the world, whether it's the quote unquote deep state that just, persists across administrations that's really responsible for driving this strategy that you just laid out here. But do you imagine any big differences depending upon who wins in November? Or is it just, hey, this is the energy policy of the machine, and this is what we're going to be pursuing going forward?
So let's talk about one of the key drivers of the machine, and then we could talk about the marginal impact of US politics at the end of it. The unspoken elephant in the room here is the development of artificial intelligence and the need for radically more electricity to feed these machines and these training. The data centers and the chips and NVIDIA and that whole boom. As a heavy user of AI, I can tell you that is a very real breakthrough, a seismic change in humanity, and the power needs to keep the world on that Kurzweilian compute logarithmic line will be met. And I think natural gas is the obvious fuel for that, clean burning. Maybe you toss in a few carbon capture facilities on the back end to greenwash yourself. But we are going to win the AI race in the US on the back of natural gas. And whether we set up our data centers here or in Argentina or in Brazil or in Guyana or in Venezuela or in Canada, it's not going to matter because we can, move electrons around the world relatively fast, and we could move photons around the world even faster. And so the need to power AI will be met. And that is going to be the great demand generator for natural gas, which is going to cause, we believe, the current glut in natural gas to be resolved, and the equilibrium price of oil and gas to be sort of met, with logistics being the only difference. Now, this is, I think, relatively bearish for the primary energy producers because they make all their money on price, not volume. And I think a Trump win would be bearish for the primary energy producers because drill, baby, drill is not something they've shown the discipline to be able to manage with any semblance of shareholder value creation in mind. Left to their own devices, they will drill themselves into bankruptcy. They do it every time. They have no discipline. And a Harris administration would be, all things being equal, more bullish for commodity equities because constraints, artificial as they might be, imposed by government, incremental constraints as they might be, because we do believe the forces of AI will eventually overcome them because the power of Silicon Valley as a lobbying force is very strong. But all things being equal, Harris is bearish for energy supply, which means it's bullish for energy equities, and vice versa for Trump. So hopefully I captured the essence of both of your questions with that answer.
You did accept the grand game that you laid out, right? About using our reserves, U.S., Canada, to, more effectively compete with OPEC, which has been keeping prices artificially high, partner with some of those countries in South America that you mentioned. To me, that feels very like both national security important, as well as just sort of, like it or not, I think we feel that the machine that we refer to is always looking out for its best interests, and that's just something it would want to do. You add the AI, national interest on top of that, winning the AI race through cheap energy. I would think that might almost overpower no matter which administration is in office. Do we? So I guess my point is like even today with the Biden administration, let's assume Harris gets reelected. Do you think they would really be able to continue to sort of push constraints on energy production, or do you think the weight of the importance of these mega trends that we've talked about in this grand game will overwhelm them?
Oh, let me be very clear. I only answered in the way that I did because you asked. I don't think it's a dominant parameter at all. I think, in fact, if you look under the Biden administration, we have become an energy gigapower, right? I mean, the shale revolution smashed right through the Trump COVID, J6, Biden as sort of sitting president in name only. The number go up when it comes to oil production, and number go up when it comes to energy demands for AI. But all things being equal was the caveat I probably should have emphasized more. In regular times, oil and gas companies make all their money during Democratic administrations because they can't impose discipline on themselves, and they need a little bit of regulatory red tape in order to at least slow their own capacity to incinerate shareholder value. If you look at what happened, in the famous price war of 2014, when Saudi Arabia declared war on U.S. shale, they radically underestimated the capacity and willingness of these the whole potpourri of drillers in the U.S. to waste shareholder money. And even filing for bankruptcy didn't slow them down. They either kept drilling or sold their good assets to those who could, and they won that price war. And that's why you see the U.S. now produces 20% of global oil and 25% of global natural gas. And again, like when we look at the energy market, like one of the last things we would do is invest in primary energy equity. These people don't really respect shareholder value. Most of the management tends to be conservative, and so they'd be voting for Trump. And in reality, they would do much better under a Harris administration. That's, by the way, not a political statement. That's an economic analysis based on history. But 85% of the variance can be explained by the insatiable demand for compute. And there's nothing on the board, not even nuclear, that can respond to that demand in a time frame that is comparable to natural gas and gas turbines. And so I think if something must happen, it usually does. And if you look at Kurzweil's prediction from the Singularities Near book, and we've written about this in a piece called Fission Ships, humanity tends to organize its economy to stay on that line. And that line is growing exponentially. I can tell you, like I have friends who work at the cutting edge of AI, and they've built me some demonstration products, for the Doomberg brand that kind of creep me out and wish like I hadn't seen that, it's kind of scary. We are at the point in the AI hype cycle, by the way, which sort of 1999, there will be a crash. There'll be a lot of AI fraud and AI hype that needs to be washed out, and there will be some market winners. The Amazons and the Microsofts back then will eventually be discovered. It's not clear to me that, for example, that NVIDIA will be one of those for reasons we could probably get into. But it's real, it's powerful, it's mind-blowing, and it's going to change the way people work. It's going to change the way people entertain themselves. It's going to radically alter the energy dynamic. And by the way, the U.S. has a deep and strong lead in this regard, which in a happy coincidence happens to coincide with our deep and strong lead in the production of dirt cheap hydrocarbons. Those two things are going to marry. And that's like a trend you can bet on.
Okay. And that's where I'm going with this. So what I'm hearing from you when it comes to oil and natural gas and its sort of, oil substitutes, looking forward, you see number go up, painting with a really broad brush, but supply-wise, number goes up. Price-wise, number go down over
To a
time.
point. I mean, this is cyclical. There'll come a point where number go down enough that people don't make the necessary investments and demand comes back. Like, again, upward sloping sine wave.
Yeah.
With a business and investment cycle that is out of sync and so slightly chaotic, i.e. nonlinear. But there will come a point where we have so much demand and the prices got low enough that nobody invested, or not enough people invested. There's always somebody investing, such that we see a spike or a geopolitical explosion, or pick your favorite, war here, pipeline destroyed there. There's always the risk because of the inelasticity of demand. So you should not make sweeping statements about the long term. I think you can be confident in the short and the long term, in the sense that in the short term right now, we have significant headwinds that need to be worked through. And in the long term, supply go up. And the price action needed to get us from here to there will manifest. And like all of this talk about net zero and peak oil consumption, it's all just nonsense. Like, it just couldn't be like literal. If you look up in the dictionary, nonsense. The IEA forecasts for oil demand are quite literally fantasy. In 2050, I believe, as I mentioned in the debate, we will be burning far more hydrocarbons than we are today. We will not go without. We won't run out of them. Just a couple of weeks ago, Chevron announced a breakthrough where they could develop, oil resources underwater at a pressure of 20,000 psi, which is a step change over what the industry thought was impossible. And now everyone will figure out how to do that, and then all of these other new resources will be unlocked. As we said in our piece about Western Canada, which I believe was titled After Trudeau, which incidentally can't come soon enough. For the purposes of modeling, the resource base in North America for hydrocarbons should be assumed to be effectively infinite for the next couple of decades. And nobody listening to this has an investment time horizon longer than that.
Yeah. And a big part of that, just to make sure I'm intimating correctly, is your comment that much easier to change a political constraint than a geological one, meaning post-Trudeau and perhaps post,
Gavin Newsom.
Gavin Newsom and even, the current administration. We could go back to a drill baby. There's still, for the drill baby drill crowd, there's still a lot of untapped resources out there.
And I think we're going to see it in Argentina, right? Before Milei, Argentina was a basket case for a century. It had basically a lost century, right? I mean, political upheaval, hyperinflation. The root causes of that can be debated. Lots of people think that the geopolitics of oil and the desire to sort of keep a lid on production of various resources around the world played a role in that, and the IMF and all of the conspiracy theories, tied to it. Whatever your views are, it's very clear that Milei has tied himself to the U.S. in every which way possible, fully supportive of the Middle East war, fully supportive of Ukraine, a much friendlier relationship with the IMF, auctioning off all of the public companies that are, of course, riddled with corruption, which they always are, and they'll be sold to the highest bidder, and opening up the spigots for external investment and trying to dollarize his economy and to generate the money necessary to pay back the country's debts. Inflation seems to be still very, very high over there, but the lowest it's been in some time. If he
It's in the single digits now, which I think is staggering.
Well, month over month, not annual. Annual is still quite high. Yeah, I think of 4% month over month, which is still quite high. If we had such a reading here, you could bet that the Fed would not be cutting rates or contemplating cutting rates. But still, yes, I mean, progress is progress. So if Argentina is allowed to flower and suddenly goes from producing, 1 million barrels a day and change to 2 or 3 or 4 times that amount, and 6 to 7 BCF per day of natural gas to 2 or 3 or 4 times that amount, and suddenly has all manner of hard currency coming in that allows it to, whip the back of inflation and and heaven forbid balance its budget and uplift the standard of living of its citizens, that's meaningful and something that, by the way, we'd be the first to cheer. So there's always demand, right? So like the demand and supply are out of sync sometimes because of the investment cycle and the business cycle, but the overarching infinite supply, effectively for modeling purposes of hydrocarbons. Look, California, we wrote a piece called "What's University Worth," where we tried to value the University of Texas, and to the nearest 100 billion, we settled on 100 billion. California has basically the same resource base as Texas. And the University of California has the same pedigree, perhaps even higher than the University of Texas school system. Texas is a global energy gigapower, and California is a flaccid energy vassal. These are just political choices. The University of California system has a net negative equity value on its books. It owes more money in the form of pensions and so on and benefits than the present value of the totality of its assets. Whereas the University of Texas, because of land grants from the 1800s, which just happened to be in the Permian Basin, and they're running this massive royalty model. The University of Texas system, not even looking at the 1/3 of the value that goes to Texas A&M, by the way, is probably worth plus or minus, in the range of 100 billion. California is zero. Those are political choices. And ultimately, for some strange reason, the people of California have decided to tolerate this because they have other inherent advantages, and Silicon Valley is there, and they get, all kinds of capital gains tax, lumpy as it might be, flowing into the state coffers. But that's not forever. And so, like, the moment California wakes up and decides that it wants to produce oil, or perhaps even more likely, the sort of coasts separate from Northern California and the rest of the state. Because I don't think the state borders and even the country borders of the US and Canada are necessarily as permanent as we're modeling. Ultimately, those resources will be developed.
All right. Well, look, for somebody that says, okay, this makes a lot of sense, Doomberg, I see your logic here. I think you have a good view of where the puck is headed. Question I want to ask is, where are the opportunities there for investors? I guess before I ask that question, I should just ask, is there anything else geopolitically, geologically, otherwise, that's big on your radar around oil that we haven't touched on yet?
The only other big one, besides, of course, the ongoing risk of war and escalation, and Taiwan and Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia, which are always there and always in the background and can always change the discussion and make everything we've talked about temporarily moot. The only big one on the board is the potential for geologic or natural hydrogen, which is something that we wrote about recently. We've now written about it twice. That could be a game changer. We wrote a piece called "In Search of the Next Shale," which is always dangerous to do, because in 5 years it could look pretty dumb. But, we try to be ahead on things and to make our subscribers think and to give them some food for thought. There does exist underground significant deposits of natural hydrogen, which is formed when water reacts with iron deposits. And the sort of, the geometry and circumstance of geology, which others, even some of our largest critics, know better than we do. They can form little sort of pockets that trap that hydrogen. For a long time, geologists didn't think that natural hydrogen could accumulate underground. It's very reactive, for one thing, but also in all of this sort of drilling for oil and gas, we'd never stumbled upon it. But it turns out that, where hydrogen is formed is sometimes and often different than where hydrocarbons are naturally formed underground. So there are massive deposits of natural hydrogen, which is a fuel in that circumstance. We always think of hydrogen as an energy carrier, not a fuel, because you have to make it from water in the modern construct in order to use it. And that takes at least twice as much energy as you could ever hope to get out of it. But if you could drill for natural hydrogen, which is a carbon-free source of energy and burns very hotly, and we know what to do with it. We could make hydrogen internal combustion engines. It's heavily used in the refining markets today. We know how to handle it. It's even more dangerous than natural gas, and it comes with its own suite of challenges, but engineers can overcome these. If we can successfully drill for natural hydrogen at the scales that the USGS are talking about might exist, That would be another game changer and a significant headwind. But you can imagine, for example, hydrogen-powered electricity plants that are powering AI and producing no carbon. Who wouldn't want that? I mean, people would be tripping over themselves to get that. And Joe Manchin, God bless him, perhaps the most informed legislator in the US in the past 30 to 40 years on the topic of energy, unfortunately retiring from the Senate after his term is done, held a very remarkable and interesting committee hearing on the prospects for geologic and or otherwise known as natural hydrogen. And we watched that hearing with great interest and have done some research on it. And if push come to shove, if you made us predict, we think that the technological power of the energy companies are going to figure out how to produce natural hydrogen in a way that is economic. And so that is on our radar, something to watch, a bit off the wall. And if it happens, you heard it from Doomberg first.
Okay, great. What's the bigger challenge there? Is it actually finding and locating these pockets, or is it actually getting the hydrogen out of them?
The drilling remains. Look, there are no commercial wells today. That's not quite true. There's some rumors of some wells in various parts of the world that are powering street lights in various, impoverished countries, and this is how we all discovered it. I find those stories to be rather dubious. But there are sort of two, not to go too deep into this, but there are sort of two branches to this. There's drilling for it, where it already exists, which of course is challenging because you need that sort of formation that traps it. But there's a whole different potential energy play here, which is just injecting water underground and having it naturally react with iron sources and then sucking the hydrogen back up, which is called stimulated production, which is a whole other area, kind of like, loosely analogous to fracking, except you're doing a chemical reaction as opposed to just, shoving sand underground and at pressure and so on. But you could imagine a world where you pump water underground, it reacts with the iron, and you stimulate the production of hydrogen, which you then collect because it's a very light gas and comes back up and fits through very small pores. That's all very speculative today. I think the first generation breakthrough would be we have found a big bunch of hydrogen and we figured out how to drill for it. The sort of the breakthrough shale type breakthrough where you would have an infinite amount basically would be because we just have an enormous amount of iron. It's like one of the most abundant metals in the crust. That's a real game changer. Again, this whole cheap oil stuff is a giant short bet on human ingenuity. And I would be very hesitant to short human ingenuity, especially as it pertains to the relentless pursuit of cheap energy. Because energy is life, energy is our standard of living. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living, and there's no greater driver for innovation than providing for your friends and family, right? And so natural hydrogen is on the board. You asked me what else on our radar that we haven't discussed. That's probably the biggest one.
Okay, and that's super fascinating. I hope we hear more about that in the future. All right, well then, to folks that are, again, very inspired by that outlook, Doomberg, and some of what you're talking about, is going to happen over the scope of the next couple of decades. But here in the nearer term, where do you see the opportunities to invest?
So, again, well, if you just ask me my personal opinion, investing directly in the commodities is challenging, and you need to be relatively sophisticated with futures and options and rolling and all of that stuff. We think that investing in the energy producers themselves is a bit of a sucker's bet. We would avoid the sector. We've never really gotten long direct producers because they drill themselves out of business. I mean, if they had a solid track record of earning their cost of capital and then some and remunerating their equity investors, that would be a different story. They just don't have that track record. So the big ones are more disciplined, but they're fairly priced and you're buying dividends at that point. And also you're sort of riding the cycle. We are more interested in picks and shovels. So any supplier to the energy sector of a critical raw material or technology or other input that makes it happen. So, you may be a land leaser and earning royalties, or you may sell sand into a fracking company, or you may sell certain surfactants that work for enhanced oil recovery. Anybody that enables production but isn't dependent on the price of the commodity is interesting. And then the most interesting to us is those that enable the closing of arbitrage. So if you are an LNG engine manufacturer in China, you're printing cash today, right? And so the enabling technology that allows the arbitrage between various hydrocarbons to close, midstream operators have a virtual monopoly in this regard. The firms that are doing the collecting of the impurities, and in this case, that's what we're calling natural gas and NGLs, and bringing them to market are printing cash because their services are in high demand. Everybody wants to drill for oil. Oil is expensive because of OPEC. I've got this nuisance. Get rid of the nuisance, make use of the nuisance. Any company that can do that is going to be doing quite well. And then that should, over the long haul, manifest in higher equity values.
Okay. Super fascinating. Doomberg, it is just always such a great joy to have you on the program. I always feel like my brain is holding onto the conversation by its fingernails, but you always make it understandable too. Really look forward to having you back on again, because again, we just dove into one slice of the energy spectrum here. I know there's many other elements that you and your team cover. Where can folks follow you and your work between your appearances on this channel?
Yeah, so we are at Doomberg.com. We have recently and successfully ejected a squatter from that domain name. But if you just go to Google Doomberg Substack or go to newsletter.doomberg.com, you'll find all of our work. And while you're on Substack, head over and subscribe to Adam Taggart. I hear he's producing some pretty good stuff as well, and is by far the best financial podcast on Substack. Substack is a growing medium, super fun app. If you don't have it, download it. I know you've enjoyed the Substack experience yourself. It is really, I think, gaining that network effect for social media, sort of like Twitter, but with a little less toxicity, I guess, is the way I would describe it. A little less volume, a little less toxicity. I'll take that. So Doomberg.com, and of course, your Substack as well. Adam, always a great pleasure to speak with you. Looking forward to the next appearance.
You're so kind, Doomberg. Thanks so much for everything. Look forward to having you back on the channel again soon. All right. Well, now's the time in the program where we bring in the lead partners from New Harbor Financial, one of the endorsed financial advisory firms by Thoughtful Money, to both react to the discussion I just had with Doomberg, as well as talk about what's meaningful in terms of what's happened in the markets over the past week. Joined as usual by lead partners John Lodra and Mike Preston. Hey guys, Mike, why don't we start with you today? What were some of your key takeaways from the discussion here with Doomberg?
All right, cool. Doomberg started off by saying that energy is life. I mean, energy really is everything. Without energy, there is no production. There's no life itself. And you can't grow an economy without an ever expanding supply of energy. So it's no surprise that energy is a key topic. And so I learned quite a bit from this talk, and I'll just share a couple of things that I wrote down that I thought were important. He pointed out that energy has been relatively cheap again, or it's actually dropped to maybe $60 a barrel recently, and it's just bounced back to maybe $67 or $68 a barrel now. But oil was 120 a couple of years ago. So where are all these calls for ever increasing cost of energy and peak oil, that type of thing? Well, we don't really want to debate the concept of peak oil here. It is the fact that oil is cheaper than it was 2 years ago. In fact, almost 50% less than it was a couple of years ago. So what is this really telling us? He talked a lot about basically if there was a real recession in China, oil would be a lot less than it is now. Oil is a recession indicator. And even though oil is cheaper, it's not really signaling in a recession yet. It doesn't seem. Although if China were to go into some kind of spiral, then he postulates that oil would be quite a bit lower. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that he talked about natural gas liquids and that the concept of energy is changing. It's not just oil anymore. It's a lot of different things. And natural gas liquids, NGLs, are important. LNG, liquid natural gas or liquefied natural gas, trucks in China are important. He mentioned that 1/3 of China trucks are LNG. So the whole concept of energy is changing, and natural gas in this country is extremely plentiful. And talked a little bit and cheap. It's probably enough for hundreds of years. And that's not to say we should be willy-nilly about it and waste energy and not be conscious of our environment. But in this country, we have a blessing, and that blessing is plentiful and cheap natural gas. Europe does not have it the same way. They pay a heck of a lot more. I think he might have mentioned, or I read it somewhere else, that actually jet fuel is a lot cheaper in Europe than it is here, but natural gas is a lot more expensive in Europe. I don't know why, but that's interesting. But yes, all about the definition of oil is changing. And then he talked a lot about AI, and that AI is a huge deal, bigger than we think. Well, I'm not sure if I agree. I think it's a big deal. And I think it's just starting, and we're going to see over the next couple of years. But it consumes a ton of energy. And he said that natural gas will fuel that energy, and that in this country, most new plants that are being built fueled by natural gas. It's very difficult to build a plant fueled by nuclear or by coal these days. So natural gas is it. And the interplay of natural gas and AI is very important. And he said we'll learn more about that going forward. That makes sense. Lastly, you asked him what types of things make sense to invest in. Well, I know that my partner John here is going to show some other data in a little bit that shows that energy has not been the place to be recently, but maybe it will be over the next 10 years. I don't know. We'll take our cues from the charts and we'll take a look at the data. But Doomberg talked about oil service companies in general. We agree with that. So if you were, just as an example, this is not a recommendation, but instead of XLE, the ETF that owns refiners, he would prefer something like the service companies, which would be more like ticker symbol XES. And that makes sense. In the past, service companies have done better than the commodity itself. It's hard to buy the commodity itself. It's a heck of a lot easier to buy the companies that service the oil industry. However, they are stocks, don't forget, and we think the whole stock market is overvalued. So do your research and understand the risks. But in terms of timeliness, we don't think energy is timely right now, but that's subject to change if we see some technicals firm up. So, those are the things that I saw there. It was neat to focus in on energy and on one sector in one of your week's talks, Adam, and those are the highlights for me.
Thanks. Yeah, it's always important because we're so focused on the economy. The economy is not a closed system. It doesn't exist, in and of itself. It's dependent upon other systems, most notably the energy system, to function. So it's really important to have to, take into account what's going on in energy if we want to know where the economy is headed. John, we'll move to you here because, as Mike mentioned, I think you had some visuals you might want to walk us through. I guess just sort of brass tacks here, if folks have listened to Doomberg and said, hey, this logic really makes a lot of sense to me, I want to look at, potentially investing in the energy space, maybe in these sort of picks and shovels, midstream companies, the ones that help, will help close that arbitrage between the cheap price of gas and oils on a relative basis, higher price. You can help people do that, right? Either through ETFs like the one that Mike mentioned, or maybe even identifying individual companies. Is that correct?
Yes, we'd like to think so. We've got a very robust toolkit to help guide us into, just generally speaking, areas of the market or equity markets that are showing strength and avoiding those that are showing relative weakness. And it's not a perfect tool set by any chance, but we do think it has good value add in guiding us to the right places. I got to chuckle every time I see Doomberg. He's one heck of a intelligent animated chicken, and I can't help but think how exciting a presidential debate would be if we had Doomberg somewhere in the middle on that stage amongst our animated candidates. But it's always a joy to hear the comments, because they are very intelligent and informed in a lot of respects of the energy market. I spent the first decade of my career in the energy market. And just some funny little anecdotes. So I exited college in the early 90s, and I was told by my peers that in the 80s and certainly in the 70s, the thought of burning natural gas in a power plant to generate electricity was blasphemy. At the time, in those decades, natural gas was thought to be relatively scarce and such a prized fuel that, doing anything besides putting it through like heating in homes and stoves and things like that, God forbid burning massive amounts in a power plant, it was blasphemy. And then, of course, there was a huge amount of production unleashed, and there's not a fossil fuel plant that I can think of, oil or coal, traditional oil or coal, that has been developed in this country for good many years, if not decades. But there's been a massive amount of natural gas power, combined cycles, and things like that. So just really interesting how things change. And I think this is one of the points that Doomberg made about innovations and ingenuity as unlocking or coming to grips with some of the supply demand imbalances that come to play now and then.
Yeah, and also just how the situation evolves over time. So your point saying that your peers couldn't imagine doing anything with this scarce resource of natural gas, other than just using every drop that you get, cubic centimeter, or however much you measure gas. And then fast forward to the past couple of decades, especially the shale revolution, where there's so much excess natural gas that it is just burned, that's just flared off because they've got that was cheaper than trying to get it somewhere. Now fortunately we're having these pipelines getting put in place that Doomberg mentioned. But the point is I think there have been many times in the cycle of the energy sector where conventional wisdom has said, well, clearly, we're either running out of oil or, natural gas is inherently scarce. Where a couple of decades later, it can be exactly the opposite. And I think that's one of the reasons why Doomberg says he sort of expects this sine wave up and to the right in terms of oil supply, meaning, yeah, it will go through cycles where it'll get tight and then there'll be a glut, but over time, for all the reasons that he and I talked about, he expects it to trend up over time. I also just wanted to mention real quickly too, Doomberg is very smart. I always invariably get comments about, hey, why the green chicken? There is a story behind that. It's not my story to tell, but it makes sense for why that team has a mascot that is the public face of the business, and that they're keeping their identities private. I will say I have met the team behind the chicken. It's not just one person. To your point about how smart they are, John, I just want to underscore that. I think of I interview an awful lot of people. The Doomberg team is right in the top 5% in terms of the echelon of just the strongest intellectual horsepower that I've come across. And just couldn't be nicer people too in person. So I understand some of the people get a little off put by the animated chicken, but I will tell you the people behind the organization are just stellar. So anyways, sorry for the editorial.
Yeah, no, so I thought I'd share a couple charts. The first one I want to share kind of gets to Doomberg's comment about ingenuity and innovation. And it's from none other than John Arnold. Many people may not know John Arnold, but he built his career as a really wunderkind natural gas trader. In fact, he was at Enron. I worked at Enron in my last stint in the energy industry, and he was by far the rock star natural gas trader at Enron. And this is a tweet he put out a few days ago that actually came across, and I thought it was very apropos. And he makes the comparison of how fracking went from essentially zero to tremendously and fundamentally changing the oil and gas industry in this country and globally, really. And you see that in some of the charts here, the takeoff of the shale gas and shale tight oil. And he kind of puts a analog chart here of the takeoff of utility scale battery storage systems, which up until 2020, they were non-existent. But even the little town in which I live in Massachusetts, it's got a municipal utility. They've installed grid scale storage. Makes tremendous sense where there are big pricing differentials between electricity prices and evening hours, for example, versus peak daytime hours. But that certainly plays very heavily into the attractiveness of renewable, albeit intermittent resources like wind and solar and things like that. Because the big downside of those intermittent resources, you can't store the sunshine, you can't store the wind. Well, this provides it. So all to say, there's a multifaceted. I'm not of the mind that we can easily transition from fossil fuels. I think, and even folks like Jeremy Grantham is a very staunch environmentalist and advocate for green energy, Fossil fuels are going to play a tremendously important role and a big role for years to come. It's just about using them smartly and unlocking through ingenuity new resources, new ways to use those resources, and that kind of thing.
Agreed. Hey, real quick, just before you get off this chart, I don't know if in the big picture, these gigawatts that we're seeing here, this increase in gigawatts is a really big deal or not. Obviously, the trajectory grabs our attention. Yeah, I've heard forever that the big challenge with electricity is storing it. Do you take from this, and I know you're not an energy expert, neither am I, but do you take from this that the revolution is underway and perhaps happening at a pace faster than the general populace understands at this point?
Oh, it absolutely is. There's no doubt about that. I'm enough of an energy geek that I know that, and I know it just simply. I have a battery system on my house. I have a solar system I've had for over 15 years now, I think, and a battery system paired to it. And I was to rewind the tapes a little bit. I was getting into the ear of the local manager of my local utility about the kind of oncoming of grid level storage. And there was a bit of a pushback and, wasn't quite prime time, but they've now adopted it because it has become prime time. It is cost effective and it certainly can complete that. So I think it absolutely is prime time and will only become more so. It's not like the panacea, but it's an important, very important link in the equation for especially balancing and frequency control, all the technical stuff we can get into, but is well beyond the the scope of this conversation. But it absolutely is taking off.
But still fascinating, and I'm making a note to perhaps interview a battery expert at some point in the future here.
Yep. So I'm going to go to back to some boring old energy type stuff here. This is just I wanted to kind of paint a picture of kind of the valuation of energy stocks as a sector. And because some of the big picture takeaways, one would be forgiven for concluding that energy stocks are probably really good values in the long-term sense, right? Not saying in the near-term sense. And I totally agree with everything Doomberg said about the short-term dynamics that production companies have a historically horrible track record of shooting themselves in the foot by basically, drilling till they, and producing until they shoot themselves in the foot. But this is a chart that shows the over time from the late 70s to now, the weighting of the energy sector in the S&P 500 index. We're at about little less than 4% right now, even though greater than 10% of the trailing EBITDA is from the energy sector. So we're at near record lows, and that's one way of perhaps saying that the energy sector as a whole is certainly undervalued relative to the broad market. We think it's partly because the broad market is very overvalued. But this is one reason that many people think that energy is likely going to do well very long term. This next chart just shows the relative performance of energy versus the S&P. Anytime this line is going up, it means energy is outperforming the S&P. Anytime it's going down, it means it's underperforming. So you had a huge, well, certainly in the post-tech bubble, energy tremendously outperformed the broad markets. And then the opposite was true post-GFC. Energy trailed dramatically the broad market. And much of the last few years here, energy has been strong, notwithstanding weakness of late. And we'll talk about that in a second. So it just goes to show that there are major trends that can flip-flop energy as a stronger or weaker investment. And having some tools to guide that decision making, we think is very important. We think we have some of those tools, and we'll talk about those in a moment.
Got it. But at a high level, it looks like we may be bouncing off of an extreme low in the data series.
Yep, extreme low, but it's since pulled back there. So we've had some pretty strong weakness. One thing I want to share is a chart. So Doomberg talked about engine switching, right? Going from combustion engine gasoline to natural gas. And this is something Mike and I and our team here have been familiar with for a long time, because we recall this stock called Westport Fuel Systems. And they're basically a Canadian company, I think, but they I think are the leader or were a leader in exactly this, retrofitting, for example, city bus systems for natural gas. And I just wanted to share a chart of that stock just to kind of show you what's happened there. So hopefully you can see this chart. This is a monthly chart going back 20 years for Westport, WRPRT. it was up at $51 back in 2011. It was, a story stock at the time, and you can see what's happened since then. Got as low as 65 cents, had a big bounce here up to almost $12 in middle of last year, and here we are back down 5.25. So this technology has been around for a real long time, and it's ironic that even though natural gas prices have been very weak relative to oil, this stock has also been weak. So don't for a moment deny the likelihood of these innovations and these shifts to technologies, but they are very, very slow moving. Retrofitting a transportation system for a different kind of energy fuel source is no easy task, and it's a lot of inertia that one needs to get over to make that happen. So I
Yeah,
just thought that was
just
interesting.
just to make it clear, I think Doomberg would agree, which is the
Yeah.
type of trend changes that we're talking about were ones that he sees. Yeah, these are the trends over the next decade or several. It's not like, oh, position for it today because it's going to pop in the next quarter. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's finish off here, and then we'll go back to Mike here because we've got plenty more to say. This is a dashboard. We call it a relative strength matrix, and basically, it's like a scorecard, almost like a sports bracket, if you will, for ranking different sectors against each other. So we have essentially all the different sectors here, and these are all ETFs that represent different sectors. And it's a grid, so every sector is represented along this vertical column, but also on this horizontal column. And it basically is a head-to-head matchup. And I'm not going to get into all the technicals here of what creates these different colors and indicators, but suffice it to say, top of the list are the sectors that are on a relative basis as compared to all the other sectors, kind of leaders. They've got the most wins, if you will, in the wins column relative to all the others. So what do you see at the top here? You see things like a lot of financials. And what I really want to do is kind of highlight how this has moved over the last couple of months. I'm going to go back 58 days just to capture a market day. And you can see, for example, some of on the right side here are sectors that have had the most degradation on a relative strength basis. And you can see some of the worst offenders here are the energy. XES is the energy services sector. XLE is the big, Exxon Mobil's and companies like that. FCG is natural gas stocks. So some of the worst and deteriorating sectors from a relative strength standpoint have indeed been the energy sector. So we've been out of traditional energy companies. We do have exposure to some pipeline MLPs through an ETF, and that's actually an area that I think Doomberg indirectly spoke of being a key. Some of these delivery and pipeline systems that can unlock otherwise resources that don't make sense to explore at this time. So I just wanted to kind of give a little glimpse as to some of the tools we use to, despite valuations, guide us into, or in this case, out of things like energy, which has been a very weak sector of certainly the last few months.
All right. Well, super helpful. And again, you're doing exactly what I want you guys to do every week on this channel, which is to show everybody how an experienced financial advisor reacts to the changing data on the ground. And a big part of your job is to know, when it looks attractive to enter into, a position and when it doesn't. And it seems like you guys have been saying, look, we like energy in the long run, but we just haven't seen great values there. Back to that question I asked you earlier, just before I hop over to Mike, John, for folks that are potentially interested in taking some positions in some of the areas that Doomberg talked about, you guys you've got the background and the tools to sit down and help people identify, sort of think through that process, correct?
Absolutely. We're happy to have that discussion. And, as much as theses make sense, we want to understand the theses. Sometimes the price action of the investments themselves are the best, endorsement of all, right? That we're seeing relative strength like we just talked about.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Mike, over to you. Today, the day we're recording this, gold has had a big move back to a new all-time high. We can always try to ascribe what's driving this, and some people will pick some things and some people will pick others, but it seems that two big things that are driving this is news of a rate cut by the ECB, if I'm not mistaken, but also the fact that the deficit for August came in at like 380 billion, which was something like 90 billion more than expected. So our drunken sailors in Congress are spending more than ever at this point. And I think gold is finally beginning to react to that, right? And this is kind of a discussion that I had in the video that released prior to this one with Gordon Long, where he basically said, look, the thing that we can probably have the greatest confidence in is that the debt's going to get even bigger from here. The central planners have kind of got themselves stuck in a debt trap, and they're going to need that debt to continue to increase to keep just the system running. The good news, I guess, for investors on that is knowing that they're committed to that, then some other things become more predictable, and certainly decrease in the purchasing power of the currency, increase, at least in the nominal value of hard assets like gold, are things that shake out of that. And maybe that's a bit of what we're seeing reflected today. So what are you taking away from gold's action?
Well, Adam, we all try to come up with a reason for why a certain asset is moving. Turn on CNBC every morning and just say, well, stuff futures are up or futures are down because of X, Y, Z. And maybe gold is up because of the ECB rate cut, or maybe it's because of the unexpectedly large deficit. But for us, gold was in a structure, and the structure indicated that we were going to see higher prices, and it's been doing that for quite a while. We've been saying on here that the structure in gold looked like we were going to reach 2,500. We're at 2,557 as we speak, at an all-time high. 25, up 40 something dollars today. And silver is coming up as well. The structure really is, from a technical perspective, predicting higher prices still. And I'll show the chart in just a minute. In fact, it's showing prices should reach roughly 3,000 now in the next handful of months, or the next 6 months, let's say, if I had to guess. And silver should come up into the mid 30s and then potentially higher from there. Now, obviously, these are only predictions of the future. They're based on the technical structure. I happen to think that it could be this news that you just mentioned, but it could really be that the market is figuring out that this game is a game, this game of musical chairs and different central banks printing money and continuing to bail out every single problem we've ever run into. I think maybe the market's figuring out that could be ending. That, coupled with central banks buying gold, has had a consistent wind at the back of gold. And I'm going to share the chart here now. Here's the daily chart of gold. And this is what we were looking at here. This is actually the gold exchange traded fund, not the future, but you get the picture. It's been a big flat base here for almost 6 months. And all of this here was plus or minus 2,500 for the last at least month. And then today we've had this big breakout. This is on a daily chart. Let's move to the weekly chart. The weekly chart has been incredibly strong. We broke out of this consolidation. And then the strongest of all is the monthly chart. Here's a 20-year chart. And we broke out of this 4-year consolidation earlier in the year, and it's been nothing but up. And yet it projects to still higher prices. Take a look at silver. Silver is pretty interesting and has been frustrating for a lot of people. The all-time high in silver is back in 2011 at 50 or so per ounce. Why isn't silver at a new high when gold is? Well, I don't know, other than to say it's a lot more volatile, much bigger industrial component in silver. But silver has been known to make big moves. Just take a look back here. Basically tripled in the space of a year. This is a double or so after COVID. And then this big, long 5-year consolidation broke out early in the year. And then look what happened. It topped out in May and then has gone through 4 months of consolidation. This has been pretty maddening for silver bulls. While gold is at new high, silver is doing this flag formation. But to me, it's very bullish. If silver breaks out to the upside, then it should follow gold. It projects up at least into the mid 30s. And again, this is an ETF, not the spot price of silver, but it's not too far off. So silver should make a big move, a bigger move than gold. Gold continues to be very powerful here. And then finally, I think we're starting to see the miners come up. Take a look at GDX, which is an ETF that owns the major miners. We've had this big consolidation zone here, and it's moved from 30 now up to 40. It looks like we're going to break higher, maybe up into the low to mid 40s in GDX. If we take a look at the juniors, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. It too has been in a nice consistent move up, but these ranges have been big. This is the monthly chart, GDX has been going from the low 40s to the high 40s. That's a 10-point range. And so it too looks like it wants to bust out into the 50s. So we're really firing on all cylinders in gold, silver, and in the miners. They're not without their risks, but I can tell you that the gold bulls are tired. It's been a lot of years that people have been waiting for these big breakouts. But right now it's firing on all cylinders. Keep your position size appropriate so you don't sweat it. And our advice would be to just stay with those positions. Lastly, I would say that we will be making some adjustments, I think, if we move higher in gold and probably selling into strength in the future. You can never pick the exact top in these things. We think that gold and silver and miners will actually go much higher, but it doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to once in a while rebalance your portfolio and make sure that you don't go all in anything.
Absolutely. We talk about the importance of rebalancing an awful lot on this channel. All right, Mike, we'll have to wrap it up here just time-wise, but very interesting to see what's going on in gold. Again, I want to give you kudos because coming into this year, you were telling people that you thought that gold was poised to make a big move. We've been tracking that, and for a while, it was still in that consolidation phase. And then, once it's broken out, it's pretty much been following the script that you laid for it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from here. One question for you that I'm beginning to get from people who have been watching this channel and channels like it, hear that most of the guests on this channel, no matter what framework or analytical process they use, are generally pretty bullish on gold. Almost all of them, or the vast majority of them at least, when I get to the question where, hey, what's your market outlook and what assets do you favor? I'd say the vast majority, gold is in their list somewhere. So for somebody that has been hearing this, but hasn't yet taken a foundational position in gold, and they're now looking at the gold price, run off to all-time highs, what general counsel would you have for them here? Would it be, wait for a pullback, or would you just say, look, if you don't have any, this is a time to just kind of, pinch your nose and get at least a base exposure in the metal, given the fact that it could run a lot higher?
Well, I would suggest to not be frozen. I would suggest to do something. If you have literally no metals and you want to buy metals, and bear in mind that our recommendation is something like 5 to 10% of your investable assets, you should do something. You should do something. Let's say that, let me just make up some numbers. Let's say you've got $500,000 in investable assets. That means $25,000 to $50,000 worth of gold and silver. And let's just say that you were going to do 50,000. I would do something right now. We think that gold and silver are going higher, so you probably could do it all, but you don't have to. And it's pretty stressful because a lot of times people are frozen and they think they've got to do all 50,000 at once in this example. And so a lot of times they don't do anything. And then you know what happens? It goes higher. And then they wait for a pullback, and then it doesn't happen. And then we have a big update. And then they just feel really frustrated. There's no reason for that. I would say that we're approaching levels that certainly are higher, much higher than a year ago. But I think that gold will be in a range from 2,500 to 3,000, and it's near the lower end of that now. And silver, which is presently at 29, I think is going to outperform and go to 35-ish. That's 20% higher and do it relatively quickly. So if I were to buy 50,000 worth today, just as a recommendation, I would do something like 20. Do something, buy 15 or 20,000. Do it now. There's no reason to wait because that'll break the ice. It'll make it easier to buy the next piece, even if it's higher. If you're buying a relatively small amount, a lot of people out there, I think, in your audience might end up with 5,000 total. For a lot of people, that might be the right amount. If that's the case, I do most of your buying in silver because silver is going to have, I think, a bigger move. And for smaller dollar amounts, those being under 20,000, probably should be more in silver than in gold. And the bigger amounts might be a little more in gold than silver. But they both should do well. I would start with something.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the answer. And folks, not personal financial advice. Mike's just answering with a broad brush as I asked him to. Obviously, if you want to take action and would like some help on that, folks should get advice from a good professional financial advisor who has taken the time to understand their personal situation, because everybody's personal situation is different. And obviously the decision you make at the end should take your full financial situation into account. All right, gentlemen, thanks so much. Another great week. Let me just start wrapping things up here. Folks, if you enjoyed the discussion with Doomberg, would like Doomberg to come on this channel regularly in the future, let's say once a quarter, to keep us updated on what's going on, not just with oil, but with the entire energy complex, please let us know by hitting the like button and then clicking on the red subscribe button below. So what was that little bell icon right next to it? As I just said, if you want some help thinking through how to invest in energy, how to invest in precious metals, or at a larger scale, how to just invest given the type of future that looks ahead of us based upon what the folks that appear on this channel every week think. Unless you have a really successful track record investing your wealth already as a good DIY investor, I highly recommend that most people seek the benefit of working with a good professional financial advisor, again, who takes into account all these macro issues. If you have a good one who's doing that for you and executing your portfolio trades for you, fantastic, stick with them. But if you don't, you're like in a second opinion from another firm that does meet that set of criteria, perhaps even Mike and John and their team there at New Harbor, then fill out the short form at thoughtfulmoney.com to schedule a free consultation with them. And as a reminder, these consultations are totally free. There's no commitment to work with these guys, no strings attached. It's just a free public service they offer to help as many people as possible, position as prudently as possible for hitting and achieving their wealth goals. Just a reminder too that we are getting ever closer. We're now about a month away from the fall online conference here for Thoughtful Money. The faculty is amazing. You've heard me list it, so I won't go through the whole list here, but just a reminder that Fred Hickey, publisher of the High Tech Strategist, one of the most respected and followed tech stock analysts in the world, has signed on recently to join the faculty. He'll be telling us all about his outlook for big tech, for the Magnificent Seven, for where the AI trade is likely headed, because that has been the cart that has been pulling the market horse for the past 2 years. What's that trajectory going to be like going forward in the future? And could there be any sort of surprise disruptions to the market through that? So anyways, if you want to sign up for the conference, get your tickets and get them at our lowest early bird price, which is still available, but not for too much longer, go to thoughtfulmoney.com/conference and secure your tickets now. And just a reminder, if you can't watch live on Saturday, October 19th, which is the date of the conference, don't worry. Everybody who registers is going to be sent replay videos of the entire conference, all the presentations, all the live Q&A within 24 hours of the events ending. And then lastly, just a reminder, if you're a subscriber to our premium Substack here at Thoughtful Money, then you get an additional $50 off of whatever the ticket price is when you go and you buy your tickets. Lastly, and then we'll wrap things up, we're going to do a surprise bonus, I should say, a bonus video next week. Actually, it'll be the day following this video. So this video is coming out on Sunday. On Monday, when we don't normally do videos on this channel, I've been getting a lot of folks asking me for videos that address the other forms of wealth that we like to remind people about on this channel. Money's very important, but it is a means to an end. And what are the things that really lead to a rich life? What are the true components of real wealth in life? Science is pretty clear on it. It's fulfilling relationships, it's purpose, and it's health. And I've had people say, hey, can you do some interviews on those topics? So on Monday, I'm going to be sitting down with an experienced couples therapist and go through the science of what makes a healthy relationship. This is a therapist who has been in practice for, about 15 years, practices with a lot of clients based in Silicon Valley, some of whom, if they could share names, which they can't, that you would likely know, experience in both the Gottman theory of relationship therapy, as well as several other methodologies. But anyways, we're going to sit down and talk about it. And just full disclosure with folks, I was looking around for a good seasoned licensed couples therapist and didn't have to look any further than my wife. So it's going to be her. Hopefully you guys will enjoy getting to meet Ashley She doesn't do a lot of these, so be nice to her. But I think you're going to find it a really interesting and I think a very valuable discussion on the practical things that really matter in life. With that said, John and Mike, another great week. Thanks so much for joining, guys. Can't wait to see what happens between now and next week and having you guys make sense for us then. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Adam. Great as always, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Adam. See you next week.